Danger at Diablo, Chapter 5. Countercharges. Inside the small jail, a gray-haired man with a lined, weather-beaten face sat frowning unhappily at the official-looking letter he had spread out on the pine table he used for a desk. He wore the 5-pointed star that identified him as sheriff of Diablo County, and his frontier Colt hung from the gun belt slung over the back of his chair. Luke McTavish was having a bad time. It wasn't the first time Sheriff Luke had had a letter that bore the territorial seal and was signed with the governor's own sprawling signature. In the past few months he had had several of them, but this was the strongest. Either take steps to clean the outlaws out of your district, it warned, in effect, or it will be necessary to ask for your resignation as sheriff of Diablo County at once. There have been several charges made that no effort is being made to put an end to the violence and crime around Diablo. A check of the record shows that few arrests have been made, and the district is rapidly getting a lawless reputation. The letter was written in the usual official secretarial handwriting, with its Spencerian flourishes, but across the bottom, in his old friend the governor's familiar hen tracks, he read, "For your own sake as well as mine, Luke, do something quick about this. You know I'm for you 100%, but with the election so near, I'm under pressure. I can't let things get out of hand in any part of the territory. I'm counting on you to round up those lawbreakers, even if you have to deputize every man in Diablo County to do it. Get busy. Your old friend, Stubby." It was easy enough to write "round them up" when you were sitting in a soft leather chair in the governor's mansion up at the Capitol, but it was another thing to be able to go out and do it. How do you round up shadows? Luke McTavish had done his best, but while he was out with his only deputy trying to track down the men who had just robbed a bank, a stagecoach would be held up, and its passengers robbed a few miles away. Sometimes the gray-masked outlaws worked as a pair. Other times one man struck swiftly and rolled away alone. Occasionally there would be 3 of them. They worked by day and by night, and a growing number of victims were getting louder in their criticism as Sheriff Luke and his deputy constantly failed to bring in the criminals who were making him look clumsy and inefficient. And now his old friend the governor had begun to feel the political effects of the situation. It couldn't go on much longer. The worst part of it was the way that people who had always been his friends and supporters were turning against him in his own town. He knew what they were whispering in Diablo, that he was getting too old to be depended on to keep law and order there anymore, that it was time he stepped aside for a younger, more active man who could run the lawbreakers back into the hills and make the county safe for new settlers, and old as well. He looked up startled as Annie herded the scowling Ruth Horton ahead of her through the doorway. Ruth's hands were lifted shoulder-high, and he was walking with an odd, swinging gait because of the missing boot heel. Annie's wide-brimmed hat was pushed back off her pretty face, and her blue eyes were stern as she held the heavy army revolver leveled at the bad man's back. Luke rose quickly and came around the table. "Well, what's this?" he inquired. "Sheriff McTavish?" Annie's tone was businesslike. "That's right, little lady." The sheriff's smile was a bit puzzled. "What have you rounded up here?" "This feller tried to steal my horse a few miles back on the road from Smoke Tree Station. I had to shoot his boot heel off, but he isn't hurt." McTavish scowled at Ruth Horton. "What do you say for yourself, mister?" The bad man met his eye with a defiant scowl. "Nothin'," he sneered. "To you. I'll do my talking in front of a judge where everybody can hear me." He looked scornfully at Annie and then turned back to Luke. "That is, if you two think you can put this over on anybody." Annie had been studying the kindly, weather-beaten face of her uncle as he and the outlaw came face to face. She had been afraid that she would see some sign of recognition or guilt on his face. Instead, she had read only surprise, and now quick anger at the sneering bad man's words. She felt relieved and happy. "What are you talking about? This young lady claims you tried to steal her horse, and I'm aiming to hold you on that charge. That's all there is to it." "Maybe it is and maybe it ain't." Ruth swaggered and smirked knowingly. "We'll see." Sheriff Luke turned to Annie with a puzzled expression. "Do you have any idea what he's driving at, miss?" Her eyes flashed angrily. "Sounds like some kind of a bluff to me, Sheriff, but he's forgetting something." She brought up her left hand with the gray hood that he had worn when he tried to steal Target. "He and the man who was with him both were wearing hoods when he tried to take my horse. The other fellow rode off, still wearing one, and this is his." Sheriff Luke snatched it from her hand. His eyes were snapping with excitement. "Gray blanket hood, holes cut in for eyes." He checked. "This is great, miss." He flashed a wide grin at her that reminded her strongly of Tag. Looks to me like you've caught quite a fish, young lady. We've been after these gray-hooded road agents for a long spell, and this is the first time we've caught up with one of them. I'm sure much obliged to you." He turned on Ruth. "Reckon you'll be boarding here for a considerable spell, Mr. Horse Thief." Annie smiled. "I think you'll find he was mixed up in that stagecoach robbery last night along the Smoke Tree Road as well. The two men who did it wore hoods like this, I heard." Sheriff Luke nodded. "Wouldn't be a mite surprised. We'll hold him on attempted horse stealing and add the rest later if the driver can tie him up with it." "You'd better change your mind about holding me on such a faked-up yarn." The contemptuous tone in the black-bearded prisoner's voice startled Annie. "You two just try bringing me to trial, and I'll get the laugh on you." "I happen to have a witness," Annie flashed. The man's self-assurance worried her. She could see that it was bothering the sheriff, too. "Oh, sure. You've got your kid brother. That'll help, I don't think." Ruth laughed loudly. McTavish's lined face was red with anger as he towered over the sneering bad man. "You won't be laughing when the jury gets through with you. This town's fed up with being pestered by your kind of varmint, and I aim to see they make an example out of you." "You don't say," Ruth sneered. "Why, the whole county'll be laughing at the old has-been that ain't had the nerve for years to make a real arrest. Wait till the word gets around that you and her cooked up a fake charge so you could claim to be on the job. They'll hoot you out of town." The sheriff glared at him. "Why, I never saw this young woman before in my life." He turned to Annie. "Did I, miss?" "Hey, Annie!" The voice came from the direction of the front door. They all looked over quickly. It was Tag, grinning at her and the tall man. "Is this Uncle Luke?" "Uncle?" Sheriff McTavish looked from the boy to Annie. She smiled and nodded. "I'm Tag." Tag came up with his hand held out. The tall sheriff took it automatically, and Tag shook his hand briskly. "And she's Annie. We just got here." "So I see." Luke was still a little bewildered by the disclosure. Ruth Horton watched with a sneering smile as Luke turned to Annie. "Why didn't you say who you were right off, child?" "I thought it was just as well to wait till you had this varmint locked up." "We'll tend to that right now." Luke reached for the cell key on his desk. "Come on, mister." "Better change your mind about it," the black-bearded one stood his ground. "It ain't gonna sound good in court." "What's he talking about, Annie?" Tag scowled at the bad man. "He's trying to wiggle out of the horse-stealing charge by saying that Uncle Luke and I cooked it up together." She smiled cheerfully at the bad man. "But it won't work. He can't fool anybody with such a silly story." "Yeah," Ruth Horton glared at her. "We'll see who gets fooled before we're through." "That's enough talk." Sheriff Luke gripped his arm and led him toward the cells. Out in the alley behind the jail, Rube Horton rode by slowly, leading Ruth's lame horse behind him. He studied the two small, high cell windows with their heavy bars. They were above a man's height, but he could reach them easily by using the cracks in the old adobe wall as a foothold. He would be back later. He rode on, unnoticed, and soon was out of town and on his way up into the hills. He was headed toward a small one-room shack they had used from time to time. He would wait there till dark and then mosey back down to Diablo to talk to his brother through the cell windows. He was not sure that John Shanley would get Ruth out of jail as easily as he thought. The Hortons took wages from the land agent, but they never trusted anyone very far, except each other. In the jail, Ruth was enjoying a meal of fried chicken and dumplings. It was much tastier food than he and Rube were used to, and he wolfed it down with much gusto. Between bites, he reflected that maybe they had been missing a bet by not letting themselves be arrested now and then if jail food was this good. And Ruth had only known it, he wasn't eating regular jail food. That particular chicken dinner had been cooked for tall, good-looking Deputy Lofty Craig by a love-smitten young waitress at the hotel. She had gone to a lot of pains to see that it was done just the way Lofty had told her he liked it, and had brought it over to the jail herself to give it to the shy young man. But alas, Lofty had been out on an errand, and the sheriff had accepted it for him with many thanks. The sheriff had promptly handed it over to his prisoner with a sigh of relief that for one night, at least, he wouldn't have to cook a meal for his captive. Cooking was one of the duties that went with the sheriff's job, and Sheriff Luke could never seem to cook anything without scorching it. As Lofty had confided to the pretty waitress only that morning and bid for a free meal. "One of these days, somebody's due to figure out how to burn water, and Luke will be the first to learn." By the time Lofty came on duty, the only trace of that dinner was a small pile of chicken bones. Sheriff Luke kept a discreet silence as he saw his deputy casting hopeful looks in the direction of the hotel. He knew Lofty would find out all about the purloined dinner next time he met the pretty girl. Annie carefully sized up the tall young deputy as she met him. His clothes were worn and his boots were old. If he was the one whose actions were bringing criticism on the sheriff's office, he certainly showed no signs of enjoying any of the loot. She decided that she would keep an eye on him and watch for signs, but for now she wouldn't say anything about her suspicions to Uncle Luke. He seemed to have enough to worry about. With the prisoners safely locked up and Lofty on guard till morning, Sheriff Luke was excited as Tag as he prepared to take them out to the ranch. "Maybe the place will seem small to you," he told Annie, "but it's been home to me ever since your mother and I came out to settle 25 years ago with your grandpa and fought Indians all the way from Iowa. Your grandpa's buried out there, and your dad and mother were married in our parlor. The old ranch is only a hop, skip, and a jump from town now, and town's getting closer all the time, but it was a long way from civilization back in those days. I recollect feeling right sad when I saw that Sis, your mother, was showing signs of falling in love with that good-looking young cavalry officer from the fort, but I didn't let on for fear she'd get to thinking it was her duty to stay single and keep house for me." He smiled at his memories. "She was a mighty sweet bride, if I do say it myself, and I know she was right happy with you young'uns and your dad till the fever took her off, but I've never got over missing her around the place." Annie nodded, and her eyes were misty with unshed tears. "I can imagine," she told him softly. "She and Dad were both pretty special." She glanced at Tag, who was hanging over Deputy Lofty's shoulder, watching him clean his new Winchester rifle. "I only wish the young feller there had had a chance to grow up knowing them, but what little he saw of Dad he won't forget, and I know you'll have lots to tell him about them both." "You bet I will." Sheriff Luke smiled warmly at his niece. "And we're going to be mighty happy out there, just us three, for a long, long time." Tag watched every move as Deputy Lofty cleaned and then deftly reassembled the Winchester. It was the first time Tag had been that close to one of the late-model repeating rifles, and he was still awed by the fact that it fired 5 shots without reloading. "Golly whiz!" he exclaimed. "What Annie could do with that!" Lofty looked surprised and a little amused. "This," he told Tag, patting the shiny weapon, "is strictly a man's gun. It would be mighty dangerous if a person didn't know how to handle it, but one of these days I may let her try if she thinks she could learn." Tag choked back a giggle and kept his face straight. They were ready to leave for the ranch now. Sheriff Luke tucked the governor's letter into an inner pocket of his worn jacket. He was still deeply troubled, but he meant to forget everything for a while, except getting his little family comfortably settled. That was the most important thing. His family. It gave him a warm glow just to say it over to himself. He hadn't realized how lonely he had been these past years. Up the street, John Shanley locked up his land office. He had sold a couple of rather doubtful claims today, but it was all perfectly legitimate. He had tucked a couple of extra Havana cigars in his breast pocket to give his old friend Sheriff Luke as he stopped by the jail. He planned to be impressed by the capture of the bad man. Then he would suggest, very casually of course, that perhaps the settler girl had been mistaken and the prisoner had really intended to buy her horse, not steal it. He would speak of how hysterical a woman could get over a thing like that. He hoped that Rufe Horton would hear and have brains enough to follow that line in his own defense. He was pretty sure that if Luke thought there had been a mistake, he would let Rufe get off with the warning. "Stupid old fool," he thought contemptuously. "Well, he'll soon be out of my way."